Now this is my favorite part of the evening where I get to talk. After you all have eaten, this is the best time. This is the perfect time to be ready. So I want to first say thank you for certainly for being here, but also sharing a little bit about what's happening in your parishes. You know, I think that what everyone in this room may not realize is that you are right now on the front lines of a revolution that is happening in our church. This is the hard time because it's a little wonky, might be a word to use, a little ambiguous, a place where there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of, well, how do we progress forward? How do we move forward? There's also a reality that we in the Diocese of Richmond are not facing at this moment as much as other places, but it is a reality, which is the church is dwindling. And the reason in the Diocese of Richmond we don't face this is because we have people moving in from other places. A lot of people moving from New England. Our Hispanic population is growing, which is beautiful. But if the Hispanic population was not growing, if people were not moving here from New England and other places, this diocesan church would be shrinking pretty dramatically. So I think it's a reality that we have to keep at the front of our mind, but not a reality that should be discouraging. I think that the Lord has put in place some powerful things in our church at this moment in time that allows the ground to be so fertile for the work of evangelization. So that is the good news. And we know, the story of Good Friday is not the end of the story. We know that there's a resurrection. We know that that happens. And in the same way, I think with this work of evangelization, if we are faithful to what the Lord is asking, then in fact, it will produce beautiful fruit that will be, as Robert described, that mighty work. So my encouragement starts with a little bit of a sad story, but I think hopefully ends with the good news. And to know that we are not alone in the journey, that Jesus is ultimately what the journey and the mission is all about. And that's our goal, that's our purpose. And I'll say this, that we as Catholic Christians have been kind of going along on this journey, and something radical happened about 2 years ago, which really changed my view of the work of evangelization and the work of our church. And I want to share that with you.
That's right. We are live in Rome, Italy, just a few blocks away from the walls of Vatican City.
All 115 voting cardinals head into the Sistine Chapel,
where they'll lock the door behind them and start the work of deciding the replacement for the retiring Pope Benedict XVI.
It's tough to get any access, as you know, to any of the cardinals because they vowed not to talk to the press.
This is a big part of why these things are kept secret, so that it doesn't turn into a political event. It's a spiritual event, ultimately.
Anything is possible once the conclave begins.
Extra omnes.
An unprecedented moment in modern times. Not for 600 years has a pontiff voluntarily relinquished his post.
Unless and until a puff of white smoke appears in the skies above the Vatican, and then we'll have a new pope.
There is no clear frontrunner here.
Whoever is chosen is going to be embraced by the 1.2 billion Catholics around the world.
The bell is ringing here in Rome, the campanone, the big ring. That means one thing, John Allen. What does it mean? It means
Habemus Papam.
Habemus Papam. We have a
listen
in.
Bianca, white smoke.
You can hear the joyous shouts and cheers of the faithful.
Habemus Papam.
Now you can't watch that. You can't watch that and not be proud to be Catholic. I mean, you just look at that and you say, "Oh my gosh, what? How incredible is this?" And I think to myself as I see this, I was telling people earlier, I've seen this about 9 million times, and the exciting thing for me is it never gets old. And what's incredible to me is really what the scene that was set in the beginning, how fascinated society is with the work of the church and the inner workings of the church. And we certainly know that the church at some moments has not been held in the best of light. But today, where our church is beautiful to see the positive press that comes from our church, and how, more importantly, how the press is perceiving the church. And what I want to say is this, people look at Pope Francis and they say, oh my gosh, he's amazing. And he is amazing. But the reality is that I firmly believe that we don't have in our church good popes and better popes. Instead, we have popes who our church needs at that moment in time. And in the same way, and maybe even more importantly, popes that our society needs at that point in time. And at this moment in time, by the power of the Holy Spirit, Pope Francis is who was sent to us to help us in this work of evangelization. And the two marks that I firmly believe Pope Francis gives to us, because people will say, well, listen, what has Pope Francis done? What has he changed? In reality, he hasn't really changed much of anything. If you look at church dogma, nothing has changed. Church doctrine, nothing's really changed. I mean, he did add St. Joseph to the Eucharistic prayer. That's good. We like St. Joseph. But overall, there's not really much that he has done. But the reality is, what he has given to the church and to society are these two things, which are the marks of evangelization: hope and joy. If we think about for a moment, how come people look at Pope Francis differently? It is because that man has a profound sense of hope and lives with a sense of joy. You can look on that man's face and you say, wow, this guy is different. He is different. And the interesting thing about it is, he is a human being just like any of us. And so the challenge to us as people who are leading evangelization efforts is, how do we grow more profoundly in these two things, hope and joy? And not hope and joy in something that's distant, that's far away, but hope and joy in the person of Jesus Christ. It is Jesus is the one who gives Pope Francis his hope and his joy, in the same way, the same man who should give us our hope and our joy, Jesus Christ. And so some reflections on just these two words really quickly. The first one comes from Pope Benedict, my favorite quote from Pope Benedict, and it says this: in our language, we would say the Christian message was not only informative, but performative, that there's something that changes, it does something, this Christian message. That means the gospel is not merely a communication of things that can be known, it is one that makes things happen and is life-changing. And I think to myself, a person with hope has to believe the good news is life-changing. Like, we have to be in a place where we really believe that is possible and tangible. And it goes on to say, the dark door of time of the future has been thrown open. And in the yellow, if you can see it from where you are, my favorite part of this entire quote, the one who has hope lives differently. And so our challenge as people in this room today, as the ones who have been bought into this vision of evangelization, who say, yeah, we believe that's important, how is it that we show others that we have hope? How do we live differently? And to Robert's point, how do we live in a peculiar kind of way? The one who has hope has been granted the gift of a new life. And so that idea of hope is really essential to the work of evangelization. The second mark comes from, the quote comes from Pope Francis. Everyone loves this quote, of course, at the beginning, especially those who work in the church. There are Christians whose lives seem like Lent without Easter, and I realize, of course, that joy is not expressed the same way at all times in life. We know that it looks different, especially at moments of great difficulty. But here's the great news about joy: it adapts and it changes, but it always endures. It always endures. There's a sense of joy that always endures, even as a flicker of light born of our personal certainty that when everything is said and done, we are infinitely loved. And so as evangelists, what is it that we are trying to convey? The fact that every man, woman, and child is loved unconditionally. Like if you want a simple message, that's the simple message. And why is society so excited about Pope Francis? Because he has a way to convey in unequivocal terms that everyone is loved. So I think that becomes our two challenges as evangelizers as we look at the church and our work, especially here in this diocese, is how do we communicate those great gifts of hope and of joy? So that's the vision, if you will, and I want to now kind of turn the page a little bit and just talk a little bit about the pastoral plan. So you have a little bit of some background on the pastoral plan, some ideas of what it is, and some of the thoughts behind it to help. There are essentially three outcomes that come from the pastoral plan. So when the pastoral plan was all said and done, we've done everything that we can. This is what the hope would be. Number one, parishioners see themselves as disciples of Jesus Christ. They see themselves as a disciple. I wish I could tell you today that 100% of people who are sitting in our pews see themselves as a disciple of Jesus. I'm guessing that's probably not true. If any of you if that's happening in your parish, let me know, because I would love to come and see it. But the reality of where we are with the pastoral plan is this has to be a foundational element that has to be our goal. That's where we have to reach. And what we have to do is not be discouraged. And that's the worst thing. That is the work of the devil in the context of evangelization, is discouragement. And so when we really look at it, if you look at your church now and you say, I think 1% of the people in those pews think they are disciples and live that way. So our goal should be, let's reach for 2%. To imagine if we had an increase of 1% of people in our pews who understood their lives as disciples, that would radically change our church. It would radically change your parish. Don't be lofty. Like evangelization has a problem with being too lofty sometimes and unattainable. But man, if we focus on that, wow. I mean, that could revolutionize the way our parishes operate. Number two, a central role of the baptized is understood and expressed as evangelization. And that partners really with number three, that our parishes fundamentally shift, that everything we do, that our essential mission, our identity, as Paul VI shared, is evangelization. And this is how it happens, that we have to look at every single thing we do as big programs to very little things like scheduling Eucharistic ministers, whatever it might be, all those areas of our parish, and say, is this particular thing leading people to an encounter with Jesus? If it is, great. If it's not, get rid of it or modify it. But the reality is that the challenge of evangelization is not, let's add 30 new things that we can do. It's choosing between goods that are happening and saying, is this that is happening the best way we can bring people to an encounter with Jesus? So it's not saying yes to more, it's saying no to good so that more good can be produced. And that looks different in every parish. I can't say, overall, here's everything you need to do, because your parish looks different than the parish down the street. So those are the three outcomes. If I would say, hey, at the end of the day, what are the three outcomes? Here they are. And we're giving this to you, by the way. We'll send this out to you, so if you are not fast at taking notes, that's okay. I should have said that in the beginning. So why a pastoral plan? Why a pastoral plan? Number one, our bishop loves documents. So because of that, we discovered a document called We Walk by Faith. And We Walk by Faith really provided the foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with We Walk by Faith, it was essentially an assessment of each individual parish in 4 categories: word, worship, community, and service, and how your parish was doing in those areas. Surveys were sent out, the bishop came and visited, parish staffs had conversations, parishioners, etc. So that becomes the foundation for this work to happen, and really the evolution, the next step of We Walk by Faith. Number 2, it proposes a renewal in culture for a parish community, not a new program or set of guidelines. This is the tragic trap that happens with evangelization. We are going to adopt the Christ Life program. That will now solve all of our evangelization issues. Check the box, check plus, we are done. Let's move on to the next thing. The reality is this, that programs certainly are a tool, but they're not the end-all be-all of what evangelization is. The other challenge with programs is this. In our parishes, we have early adopters. Early adopters are super fired up. I mean, you could say, come and stand in a field with me. We're just going to hang out for 3 hours. They're like, that's great. I'm going to sign up. Let me come. I'm ready. And those people are great because you know what you can do? You can make an announcement at Mass, and you can put an announcement in the bulletin, and they'll come. So that's good for the first 10% of people in your parish. But the question then is, what happens to the other 90%? How do we engage them? So we're used to ministering to the 10% because that's, I don't want to say that's easy, it's just less work. And then ministering to the other 90%, that's where the hard work comes. And if we think about where we invest our energy, it's in that 10% versus the 90%. I'm not trying to get down on anyone. I'm just sharing some observations of what is necessary for this to change. So it really is a change of culture. It is a complete change and radical shift of parish culture. Built on the concepts, of course, of new ardor, new methods, new expressions, and all those things are important. The big thing to know, which I think at this point has gotten across, is new evangelization is not about a new website. It's not about new technology. Technology is a tool, but it's not the end-all and be-all of it. And sometimes, honestly, technology can be a hindrance to evangelization. It can be a hindrance to evangelization. Empowers and expects every parishioner to take an active role. It empowers and expects. So how do you empower people to take on the work of evangelization, and how do you expect it of them? Huge challenge, huge challenge. And then lastly, as the plan is put together, the efforts are twofold. The first 3 years focuses internally on ourselves and those people coming faithfully to the church every week, week after week, or month after month. And then the last 2 years focus on outside of the church, outside of the campus. And there's an intentionality to that. So I'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit about the structure. So the basic premises of the plan, it's a 5-year plan, which you all have in front of you, or most of you should have at this point, which looks like this. So this is the plan document, if you will. And it's broken up into 5 sections, which essentially are 5 years or 5 themes. These 5 themes propose really a progression that starts on the first Sunday of Advent every year and ends on the Feast of Christ the King, which is typically at the end of November. So each year a new theme is proposed and follows the liturgical year. The important thing to note here is, while the diocese will continue to move forward, parishes may not necessarily move forward at the same rate, and that's okay. The big goal of evangelization in our diocese is this: forward progress. And forward progress looks different for every single parish, and the rate of that progress looks different in every single parish. So right now, if you're thinking to yourself, wow, the plans were due September 1st and I haven't done mine yet, that's okay. The fact that you are being here tonight is forward progress. So that's what we need to do. Keep it at front of mind, keep making forward progress, and the important thing is to really think about and pray about how this is going to work in your parish. So know that you may spend 3 years in personal encounter, and that's okay. Don't feel bad about that. Feel good about that, because that's where your people are and that's where you need to be. Goals and measurements are set and maintained by each parish. So in your parish plan, there are goals that you'll set up based upon how you're assessing where evangelization needs to happen the most, where the prioritized gaps are, and then you will measure how that's going. I can't, from a diocesan office, say, well, let me come in, let me swoop into your parish and make some random assessment, not having been part of that parish, and then leave you with all this work to do. That's crazy. But you have been in your parish, you've lived in your parish, you know what the strengths of your parish are, and you know what the gaps are in those obstacles to authentic evangelization. So what do the years look like? Here they are. It's very hard for you to read. That's okay, because I'm going to give you a little summary of what's up here. It's all in the document, so you can read through that. The first year is about personal encounter. Here are the key highlights of the first year. Number one, that every single person in this room needs to have your Jesus story. I am in love with Jesus Christ because this happened to me. X, Y, Z. That should be a story that is clear and concise. It should be a story that doesn't take 3 hours to tell, because the attention that people have is not going to last that long. If you're compelling enough, they'll want to hear more, and that's the important thing. But how do you tell that in 2 minutes? How do you tell it in 5 minutes? That's the challenge. So every single person in this room today should have that in their back pocket ready to go. There are some parishes already who have parishioners at Mass who come up after communion and they share that story. I got a call from a woman in my office. I always say when someone in a diocesan office gets a call from someone they don't know, it takes a lot of effort to kind of figure out who is that person and how do I get there from someone sitting in the pew. So it's a lot of effort. That person went through a lot of effort to get to me. And she left this message. She said this: I have been away from the church for 20 years. I went to this parish in your diocese, and there was someone who spoke after Mass about their encounter with Jesus. I was so moved at that moment to know someone had a very similar experience to me. And I knew at that moment that I could come home. That was it. One person at a time. Very small, but huge for that person's life. Huge. So telling the Jesus story. The second thing is looking at how do we share that story and how do we pass those skills on to others. So how do we then, once we understand how to tell our Jesus story, how do we then empower others to tell their Jesus story? So at the end of this year, basically, or this thematic year, it would be everyone in your parish is able to tell their Jesus story. Huge. That's the beginning, that's the foundation. That's all, you can do that. Should be, 2 weeks, done, great, check it off. And then certainly continuing to look at your evangelization efforts, put your team together, build the parish plan, etc. Then next, year 2 is focusing on the domestic church. So there are some things that have already been progressing along, looking at marriage preparation and rolling out a new program pertaining to new guidelines for marriage preparation. The second piece that we're looking at is looking at the Synod on the Family that just happened, the Extraordinary Synod, and the other Synod will happen next year. So looking at the inputs from that, and we see already some of the themes bubbling out. How do we invite back divorced couples who feel alienated from the church? That obviously is going to be a main theme of this year. How do we help bring people back to the church? The domestic church, the family. How do we help support families? And more importantly, probably the very beginnings of our actual first work of evangelization, which is the hardest. We start with the hardest and get easier, which is how do I invite a fallen away family member back to church? My sister is 33 years old. She lives in Northern Virginia. She goes to a non-denominational church. She grew up the exact same way that I did. And it breaks my heart every day. And it is hard for me to have that discussion. It is the hardest discussion I will ever have in my life with my sister to say, come home, come back. Bring your kids, with you. Bring your husband with you. So in order to encourage the language to have that conversation. So that's year 2. So hopefully that's the hardest. Year 3, equipping the parish. So this is when we begin to look at the parish and say, okay, are we a welcoming parish and are we also an inviting parish? What's in place so when people start coming back, how do we welcome them? How do we invite them in? How do we bring them through the doors? And how do we keep them engaged? Some of you are already doing some of this work, which is great. And we'll continue to do that and offer some more ideas and more resources. Then years 4 and 5, this is the Pope Francis years, if you will. This is the missioning disciples. This is the mission fields. This is where Catholics get scared. Very first bullet, coordinate door-to-door evangelization efforts. Yikes. Door-to-door evangelization efforts, go 2 by 2. Don't be creepy. That's how it works. That's how it works.
Be sane, be polite, and what did you say? And honest.
And honest, exactly. Polite, honest, and sane, and not creepy. And Robert's going to talk about actually a parish who already is beginning to do that. So we want to share that kind of story with you and how that works. It also is continuing to expand our ecumenical dialogue. So how do we work and cooperate with other faith traditions within our parish boundaries? And again, some of you are already doing this great work and continuing that. How do we connect more with our local planning areas or our geographic partners, with the diocese, with people outside of our diocese, outside of Virginia, the Universal Church? So how do we work on missioning, and how do we see ourselves as in a missionary spirit? And how do we do that practically, starting from our parish boundaries? If you are a parish who has a lot of people who come from other places, that's great. But the reality is you are still, for the most part, there are only a few exceptions in our diocese who are territorial parishes, which means you have lines that draw, and every single household in that boundary is entitled to hear the good news. They are entitled. They won't all respond. That's okay. That happened to Jesus too, so don't worry. Plenty of examples. So, again, year 4, it's a little ways away. We will help you. Don't get worked up about it, but no, that's where we're heading. Because if we really, as I think the video about Penn is so telling, that if we are so moved by the Savior of Jesus Christ, why would we not share that with other people? How much do we have to hate those people to not share that good news with them? All right, that's my soapbox. All right, so here's some things, evangelization coordinator and team. The coordinator should not really be a member of the parish staff. I only say this because the parish staff is burdened and has a lot going on. Not that people who are not on parish staffs don't, but the reality is that the work of people in the parish is so important, and having that role is so critical. Number 2, teams should be created for each year. So the idea would be is that you have a team, and teams don't need to be ginormous. Some people think, gosh, I need 30 people on my team. That is too many. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. Like 3, 5, 7, that's great. 7's a perfect number. Perfect number. So you may think you need something big, but you don't. And the thought would be is that every year you have a new team that's formed with different people that focus on each particular year. The reason for that is this. Number 1, hopefully you won't get too burned out. Number 2, just because we move on to year 2 doesn't mean we forget about personal encounter. Like, oh, well, we've already done that. Who cares about that? We're just move right on to marriage and family. It's great. So we keep that going. So if you imagine every year we're adding something new, but continuing with that foundation. Number 3, the important thing is to remember you now hopefully will have new people coming into your church who come with a particular fervor and a particular zeal that is probably beyond that fervor and zeal that you may have, because they have just heard the good news in a new way. It's been represented in a way that's compelling. So to bring those folks in and ask them to share in that work of evangelization is critical. The other thing that's important to look around, someone mentioned to me last night, what did I notice about the room? And I said, well, I don't know. What did you all notice about the room? And they said, 90% of us have gray hair. And that's a great thing because you all are keeping this church alive. You all are keeping this church alive. But the reality is, how do we engage younger generations? That's the age-old question. If you got an answer for that, you let me know. But this is the beginning of it. This is the very beginning of it. Each year, a new implementation guide will be shared following a similar framework. So we have out on the table as you leave, if you haven't picked up one yet, we have an implementation guide, which basically gives you some questions to ponder as you're assessing your parish for each particular year. So what are the signs of an evangelizing parish that has embraced the personal encounter? What are the signs of an evangelizing parish that have embraced the domestic church? So that's essentially what these implementation guides do, and those will be released every February around that time frame. So this one that is there is now for year one. That gives you, again, some guidance. This is not a must-do. This is a tool for you to help. So if you have another way of doing it, that's okay. And then lastly, you'll develop a plan to implement evangelization efforts in your parish. So the biggest thing that you can do now are three things. Number one, it starts with prayer. We must realize that we are not the ones doing this work. We're co-workers in that work, but it is God who is doing it. And we need to pray for that guidance, pray for the Holy Spirit to strengthen us, to encourage us, and to support us as we go out into this. Number two, your Jesus story. What is it? What is your Jesus story? And then number three, what plan do you have to work through year one in your parish? So some tools that we have to help you. Certainly we have the plan, we have the prayer cards, we have the implementation guides. There is a newsletter that goes out every month, and during that month we highlight work that's being done in parishes across the diocese. So something great for you to think about in terms of, we'll subscribe you to that, so when you get that, you will see here's examples of things happening in other places and other resources that have become available. For programs that are out there that you may be interested in, a lot of people are probably already doing them, so we can help support you in terms of ideas. Hey, do you think this will work in my parish or not? And also there's great resources available for free. You may have to go out and purchase them if you did it yourself, but the diocese has them available through a lending library for free that you can use them and not pay anything, so that will help you. Number three, we have money available. Always exciting. People love to have money available. We have 3 grant cycles, one in March 1st, June 1st, and September 1st. So those guidelines are available online. This year we have already given out over $60,000 in grant money to parishes. An exciting one that we just gave out was for a parish out in Roanoke who has a very diverse population, and they speak, I think within that parish there's maybe 4 or 5 different languages that are on a typical Sunday. And so there is a system that exists that allows people who don't speak English to grab these devices which will translate what's happening in the Mass real time for them. And so they said, listen, this is going to revolutionize our parish and it will help in evangelization efforts. And that was a grant that was requested and approved because that is a great example. So I think when we think about doing evangelization efforts, think outside of the box, think big, because we're looking for really innovative methods, innovative expressions that have a certain amount of ardor attached to them. So just really think about that in terms of, as you're going through, don't limit yourself. Yes?
Is there a component of this in Spanish? Is it the same thing?
There is the pastoral plan is available in Spanish. Also, the prayer card is available in Spanish, and Sister Ima has been putting together workshops similar to this in Spanish as well. And there's also Spanish resources available, as well as, Spanish resources available as well.
There were some Spanish editions of this out on the table.
Correct. I think there are some out here. If there were not any, if they've been all gobbled up, our office can provide them to you. So what I'm going to do at this point, I know you may have some questions, but I do want to give the floor back to Robert because he wants to share some parish examples with you of things across the country that are happening. And then with the remaining time we have left before 8:30, we will entertain any questions you all have. So I'll turn it back over to Robert.
While you get the slides back, I just want to share this. I've been really taken recently by just the art of storytelling, and I tell the story of Jesus using this method. Here's like the secret to our success, so to speak, is Pixar there was just a bunch of computer geeks. They went to a guy named Robert McGee, who is a consultant on Hollywood scripts, and he said, help us tell a story. And this is the method. Every day until one day, and because of that, now we have this. Take that simple way. Every day, until one day, what's the disruption that happened? And because of this disruption, this happened. And because that happened, this happened. And now, here I am. Very simple 5 points to go through. It can be a model to craft your own story. Okay. So, and that, again, that's, as I was walking through Galilee, that's what I was thinking. What is a compelling, because every story is a narrative, but not every narrative is a story. Really representing and telling the story of Jesus in a way that is fresh and new and real and compelling and just gets in where people lives. His story, your story. Even the most kind of separated, because if you know Joseph Campbell, who talked about myth, he just looked at all myths. And even he said that the story of Jesus is the most compelling myth that there ever has been. It's a powerful story. His story is a powerful story. But so is yours. Your story of your encounter with the Lord Jesus is powerful. So, with that, I want to talk about, because that, if you think about ministry as like you have your quiver filled with your arrows. Your story is one of those arrows. Your ability to tell the story of Jesus is one of those arrows. Now, the circumstance for that, I want to talk about St. Pius X Catholic Church in Santa Fe Springs. I'm going to present models of two different churches and what they did when they took new evangelization seriously. Santa Fe Springs, what they did is they said, we're going to divide our parish into quadrants. So they took their parish boundaries quite literally. And every year in January, they do a training with leaders in the parish on how to go door to door. So in year one, in January, I can't remember what year they're going to be in now, they're going to go through a training, and they will knock on every door in the parish in February. And what they want to do is they want to invite people in. Their goal is to get them onto a retreat. But what they're doing is it's a very diverse area. Some middle class, some lower class. But they'll say, if you ever have problems paying your light bill, please apply for some help. Our church could help you. If you're ever without food, please come by our food pantry. Happy to help you. This is an interesting ministry. If you have a job interview and you need someone to watch your children, we would be happy to help you do that, and we would also provide a bus pass for you to get to the interview. If you need a good church home, we're here. I told this story. A friend of mine is he's a priest or had been a priest for the Diocese of Memphis, and his uncle had died. So he was shaking hands in the receiving line, and his mother, who's actually from Oxford, Mississippi originally. His mother was there in line greeting people, and this one gentleman came up to her and said, hello, was that your son? Yes, that's my son. He was the priest. And that was your brother. Yes, that my brother was the one who died. And he said, well, I'm a Satanist high priest. And she went, well, everyone needs a good church home. So everybody needs a good church home, right? But what their goal was is they wanted to bring people to a retreat. They broke them into small groups. And I'll say a bit about that in a moment. They wanted to break them into small groups after the retreat, move them through, and then to bring them to a second retreat that was focused on the Eucharist, and then to bring them into RCIA. There's a priest in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles who one day had his door knocked on by volunteers from St. Pius X. So then they move on. In the second year, they go to the second quadrant. Year 3 to the third quadrant. Year 4 to the fourth quadrant. Year 5, they're back into quadrant 1. Okay. So, again, here's it's called, they borrowed this. This was developed in Mexico, but from what they're telling me is that this is completely renewing the church, particularly in Colombia, the country of Colombia. So it's, in Spanish, you can kind of figure it out, it's System of the New Evangelization. Their goal is to meet the spiritual and material needs of all people living in the parish. They canvass the quadrant. They host a retreat for those who are canvassed. Then they conduct weekly classes after the retreat and have small group gatherings, host a second retreat that is focused on a commitment to the person of Jesus, and then they bring them into RCIA. Okay. So that is an example of in an urban setting and a diverse setting. There's a couple of assumptions in this system. One is that there is a specific outreach to the poor, that they have something to offer. The second is the assumption is that it is a community that is welcoming of people and that have the intention of outreach. So we were talking, there's intra gentis, the work of continuing to evangelize ourselves. But here's the thing about it, is the universal documents of the church say that we are not evangelized until we become evangelizers. The work of discipleship is not complete until the evangelized are the one who are evangelizing. That is what missionary discipleship is. So now, I want to take a look at another church. This is St. Michael's in Findlay, Ohio. I'll tell you just demographically what Findlay is like. It is a town of about 50,000, and it is it's in the center of the county, and it is the only Catholic church in the county. So when I was profiling churches, I wanted to find somewhere that was rather urban, like at St. Pius, and then to find somewhere that had very large parish boundaries. And that was the only church in the area. So what did they do? Very American. Like if the system for the new evangelization was developed in Latin America, this is very North American. So what do we do as North Americans? We have a survey. We administer a survey. They stated their goal is this: we want to reignite the faith of those who've grown cold and fallen away from the church. So they did that. They administered a survey to any address they could find. If it was an email address, they emailed it out. If it was a mailing address, they mailed it out. And they wanted to ask, what's the perception of our church? How are we meeting spiritual needs? What is your deepest need in your life? And the last time, when I was putting this together, and I haven't looked in a while, they were conducting a second survey, but it was online, so it might be there. I should look. So after that, after they got the survey, they got a group of people like this, about 100 people from their parish, took a look at the results, and then they had a synod in order to state the priorities. So they stated the priorities, then they acted on them. Part of that was, it was home visits to families who had First Communion in the last 5 years. And then they implemented from the Paulist Awakening Faith, a small group program. The common denominator, these are just 2 parishes that I've seen, that I'm profiling here, but parish after parish that are very successful, the 2 common denominators, it's an effective use of small groups, and it's home visits of some kind. So there is a sense of going out to the peripheries. St. Michael's is a little bit safer because, particularly for Jerry, who's the DRE, because she had worked with the families of First Communion. They knew her, so they weren't threatened by her. Okay. I asked Guillermo, who is originally from Mexico at Santa Fe Springs, and in his affected accent, I asked him, I said, "Didn't you have doors slammed in your face?" And he went, "Yes, but it did not hurt. It did not kill me." So, he accepted that. Perfect love casts out all fear. Perfect love casts out all fear. If you know you're loved by God the Father, then you can have it as a badge of honor. I think the hardest part is when they say, "Yes, come on in." That's the hard part. Yeah, that's right. Now what? Have your story ready, because it's not a sales pitch. It is a disciple sharing their story of how the Lord changed and affected them. And it's an invitation for them to encounter the same thing.